Hello and welcome to our second video lecture. The previous video lecture was an introduction to our course on federalism and decentralization. We started off with a few general concepts, of course, federalism and decentralization being the twin concepts at the core of all this. Federalism is a political system where the central government and regional governments share power and where self-rule for the regions is combined with shared rule for all. The autonomy of regional units is constitutionally entrenched in federalism. Decentralization, on the other hand, addresses similar issues and promises similar things, but this is done through devolving the centre's power, hence the emphasis on the de-center and not through the constitutional recognition of the region's autonomy, as it is the case in federalism. There is a rich scholarly tradition on federalism and decentralization, but this is mostly based on the experience of the federations of the Western world. We had talked about how, in this course, we will combine that rich scholarly tradition with a new substantive context of Africa. Our particular focus is on federalism and decentralization in the African context. The reforms of the 1990s, bringing in the twin concepts, came to promise enhanced democracy, bringing in good governance, and help managing diversity. It is these three promises that we examined a little more in depth in the last lecture. The first promise, about bringing democracy closer to citizens, empowering local communities, introducing democratic accountability, and allowing regional and local governments to balance the centre. A horizontal separation of powers between multiple orders of authority, in other words. Federalism and decentralization's second promise is to bring in good governance and efficiency by bringing policies closer to local concerns that bring in the customization of policies and allow regional variation that could act as regional laboratories of policy making and implementation. And lastly, we talked about the promise to help manage ethno-linguistic diversity by providing territorially based communities a degree of autonomy to manage their own affairs. Today, we will continue from where we left off. As you might have noticed, while discussing their promises together, we still keep federalism and decentralization separate. Their promises, design, and even day-to-day workings might often appear similar, but there is an important conceptual difference between the two. In federalism, the regions are autonomous. Of course, the degree of autonomy the subunits enjoy vary from one federation to another. But even when the region in question is, say, small, weak, poor, and dependent on the centre, it nonetheless enjoys a constitutionally entrenched, let's say, semi-sovereignty. So federalism is about the autonomy of the regions. While in decentralization, the power exercise is devolved from the centre. Local governments could be very large, strong, rich, and influential, but at the end of the day, their autonomy is not enshrined in constitutions. They are exercising national functions that have been devolved to them. Decentralization is about devolving the centre's powers to the regions. Now, this might appear as a semantic issue, but particularly when there is a political disagreement between the orders of government, it carries with it utmost importance. For this reason, we should perhaps unpack the twin concepts a little more before we proceed. Federalism allows regions a constitutionally legitimate basis on which they can disagree with the centre or indeed with other regions. There is a sense that the country is formed through a union of these regions and that in certain areas the regions are autonomous, the mix of self-rule and shared rule we had mentioned earlier. In decentralization, such a constitutionally entrenched legitimacy protecting the autonomy does not exist. In federalism, the existence of the constituent regions and their autonomous powers are constitutionally guaranteed. That is, they cannot be created, merged, or abolished by ordinary legislation passed by the central government. This insulates them against potential encroachment by the centre. Decentralization, on the other hand, is by definition an act of the centre as it devolves some of the powers to the regional and local governments. The existence and autonomy of the subnational units are not enshrined in constitutions. Their numbers, borders, and powers could be determined and changed by the central government. What they do and how they do it could be set by the centre. For example, some aspects of education policy can be decentralized to the local level of government. And if after a few years, let's say, the results don't turn out to be satisfactory, the central government can then reclaim its powers through changing the legislation. In federal systems, on the other hand, the central government could do no such thing, because these policies by default belong to the regional states. But in order to avoid the confusion, let's potentially be clear what we mean by this constitutionally entrenched protection of autonomy. In some countries in Africa, like Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Kenya, decentralization reforms have indeed been codified into constitutions which now acknowledge the local and regional levels of government. But these clauses refer to decentralization in comprehensive terms, as part of the entire state architecture. The number of local government units could increase, decrease, existing ones could be merged into bigger ones, new ones could be created by breaking up older ones. The centre could devolve new policies to the regional and local government levels, or existing ones could be reclaimed. The individual subunits lack the direct constitutional recognition and protection American states, German Länder, Swiss cantons, and Canadian provinces have. Now, it is imperative to note that in theory, decentralization can be part of the state structure in unitary states and in federations. Most Scandinavian countries are constitutionally unitary, but they practice strong forms of decentralized governance, for example. So one could have strong local governments through decentralization in a unitary state. That is the case in Scandinavia. The United States has both powerful constituent regional states, whose powers and autonomy are constitutionally enshrined, as well as strongly decentralized local governments within these states, implementing both national and state legislation. So one could have both the autonomous regional states of federalism and the local governments of decentralization. But in some federal systems, the local government level functioning below the regional states could be relatively powerless or indeed non-existent. Federalism can therefore coexist with centralized governance within the regional states. The existence of autonomous and strong federal subunits enshrined in the Constitution does not mean that the local level of government below has to be equally strong. For a long while, for example, Belgium was a decentralized unitary state. That is, it had provinces responsible for exercising the national powers devolved to them. In the last few decades, the country has become federal, giving its constituent ethno-linguistic communities constitutional autonomy. But federalization in Belgium has gone hand in hand with the gradual erosion in the powers of the provinces which used to operate below the new constituent units of the federation. While a conceptual difference between the two terms is important, the practice could sometimes blend into each other. The practical distinction between federalism and decentralization is a little blurred, particularly in African cases where federalism and decentralization arrived together as part of the big bang of democratic reforms of the 1990s. The reforms had brought a number of large-scale democratic changes that rearranged the entire state architecture. Federalism and decentralization were often part of the same reforms. For the three big federations of sub-Saharan Africa, that is to say South Africa, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, federal constitutions were part of post-conflict democratization settlements, which also created newer forms of local governments. Federalization was not an act of formally separate units coming together in a federal union. It was a top-down creation of new constituent entities, some with cultural, ethnic, historic, social and geographic roots, and some without. Some regional subunits even saw their borders and powers change through legislation passed at the centre, albeit through special majority requirements. The fact that federalism and decentralized governance belong to the same constitutional settlements and have been put in place at the same time have made most of their functioning inseparable from one another. And this is not only valid for the African federations. Decentralization in the constitutionally unitary states of sub-Saharan Africa has also been part of the same large-scale top-down institutional change reform projects. We have devoted most of our second video lecture to unpacking the similarities and differences between federalism and decentralization, both in theory and in practice. Now, this is not a mere exercise in semantics, since the labeling can determine whether it is the center or the regions that have the prerogative. In other words, the labeling can determine who is right and who is wrong. And we'll be continuing exactly from where we left off in the next video, lecture 3. Thanks.